Andrew and Dr. Grudem, thank you guys so much for joining the conversation. I'm going to say a prayer for us and we'll get started. But real quick, Andrew, how's everything in Louisville? You guys hanging on up there okay?
Yeah, everything's going great. It's been, honestly, it's some of the two nicest days we've had in months, past couple days this week. And so low humidity, decent temperatures, been great.
That's great. And I guess it's not decent temperatures out there in Phoenix, Dr. Grudem. How's everything out in the Sun Valley?
It's very bright and hot. I don't know the temperature outside, but I was out walking this morning and it was hot.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you guys joining us. And let me say a quick prayer for us and we'll jump into the conversation. Let's go before the Lord. Father, we do come before you this day with grateful hearts. I'm grateful for these brothers and any sisters that may be joining us also in the faith. I'm so grateful that you have called us into fellowship with yourself through your son, Jesus. I'm so grateful that you called us into active ministry, that we've been gifted. We've been called to use those gifts to serve you. I pray that we would do that faithfully and with a full heart. Father, also, I pray in this moment that a prayer of gratitude that our nation has overturned what I know many of us, I hope all of us believe is really a godless stance on the understanding of human life and what it is. I do pray that in coming days and weeks, there would be a new dignity that returns to both life and sexuality in our country, and that you would help us as pastors, administrators to lead our congregations and through our congregations, our communities toward truth and righteousness and justice, toward what is good and beautiful in your sight. And so, Lord, I pray this conversation would serve even to that end. And we ask all this in the name of Jesus. Amen. So thank you guys again for jumping on. I want to just jump in real quick with a kind of a technical question. How did this happen? Like, how did the Dobbs case overturn Roe v. Wade and overturn kind of the Casey law or Casey decisions that have been on the books for many years?
I'll always defer to Dr. Grudem first to answer.
Well, a lot of factors came into play. George H.W. Bush put Clarence Thomas on the court in 1991. And then George W. Bush, second President Bush, put John Robertson and Samuel Alito on the court in 2005, 2006. And then Donald Trump followed through on his campaign promise and put Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett on the court in 2017, 2018, and 2020. So that made 6 justices who hold in general to a original meaning or a textualist view of the Constitution as opposed to a living Constitution view. They hold to the position that the legislature, the Senate and the House, with the signature of the president, are charged with making laws, and the court is charged only with interpreting laws and interpreting the Constitution. Now, that setup led to a series of cases in which the court has reaffirmed that the Constitution means what it says in plain English, according to the original public meaning, the meaning that a normal, ordinary reader would attribute to it at the time it was written. And on that standard, there's no right to abortion in the Constitution. I read through the decision, the majority decision by Justice Alito last night, and he goes to great length explaining why the doctrine of stare decisis, the idea that established precedent should not be lightly changed, did not apply in this case because it wasn't grounded in the history and tradition of the United States in any reasonable construal of history. And that Roe v. Wade and the subsequent Casey decision were wrong in trying to find in the Constitution a right to abortion that wasn't there. So it's a major victory for pro-life cause, for the pro-life cause, but it's also, in a broader sense, very significant because it's a victory for original meaning of the Constitution, being the governing understanding of the Constitution that will hold true in the Supreme Court's decisions coming in the future. And I think it has potential, or likely will set the tone for what will be acceptable in the legal world in the United States for decades to come. And it means that the political left has lost one of its most powerful weapons for controlling American society. That is the decrees of activist judges who have invented laws that find no basis in the meaning of the laws that have been passed by Congress or in the Constitution. So I'm very, very thankful to God and very excited about it. It's the result of the work of probably millions of pro-life people tirelessly throughout the last 49 years to try to overcome what was a very bad decision and allowed essentially murder of unborn children.
Thanks for that, Dr. Green. Anything to add? I mean, even just about the mechanics of the particular case, Andrew, that was really helpful, Dr. Green.
Yeah. So effectively, what Dobbs did was to chip away at the central holdings of Roe and Dobbs. And the central holding in Roe and Dobbs, well, in Roe, it was the viability test. And so basically that it created this artificial construct that the state only has a compelling interest in protecting life once life is eligible to be living outside of the womb. And if you read Samuel Alito's opinion, he's exactly right to say that doesn't have the pretense of being a legal opinion in Roe. It's an act of raw judicial will, to quote one of the dissents from Roe, where they're trying to craft policy. The Supreme Court is, and if you go back and read Roe, like they're utilizing science in order to legislate, which is not the role of the court. And so then in Dobbs' impact on Casey, they began to chip away at the undue burden test that the plurality held in 1992. And really what Alito did there is to say, he goes back and cites Justice Scalia's dissent in 1992 and says that undue burden is a standardless standard, that who defines what undue burden means. Undue burden means something that ought to be defined by legislatures, not by courts, once again. So it's really, if you've been following the pro-life movement, what you saw in Alito's opinion isn't actually all that shocking. All it is more or less an omnibus collection of pro-life arguments that have been made over the last 5 decades. And they just had the opportunity to put all of those together in one document. And so it's really not super original as far as the arguments. It just kind of dismantles the tests of Roe and Casey. 2 quick things that I'll note about what the decision, I think, indicates for a moral worldview is it's a revolution, in effect, that is very quiet and can easily go unnoticed. But on page 78 of the PDF, or I think if it's his decision, or the majority opinion, I forget which, there's this breathtaking language that Alito writes that says, under rational basis review, we believe that the state has a compelling interest to protect all of life. And so what they did was they removed that subjective test of viability and inserted in its place a more objective standard, which is life itself. And so the law, and as far as the Constitution is concerned, the Constitution now gives the presumption to protecting life at all stages rather than carving it up. And that's significant. Now, again, the Supreme Court isn't necessarily saying that that's law now properly. It's that it's now within the state's interests, and it's now shot back to the states. And the states have that presumption in their crafting of legislation on the right to protect life. So it was really, really significant from a moral worldview perspective.
All that's so helpful. So kind of from there, I think that's a great jumping spot to the next question. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of discussion, legislation that's going to happen in states and maybe even at the federal level. So help us just think through, and I don't know where all the guys here are necessarily represented, but let's say you're in what I'll call like a more pro-life state, or you're in more pro-choice state. I'd love to, let's say a guy's in Mississippi and a guy's in California. I'd love to look at a case study of kind of what that might look like in either state. And one kind of additional question that you guys can speak to, even in the more pro-life states, a lot of these laws obviously were passed when they really didn't have any teeth, laws restricting abortion. Now that they do have teeth, now that they will go into play, I'm assuming that the fight against them will be ratcheted up. Are any of those in peril or subject to any of that fight that may come back now that there's actual kind of teeth about them? So I'd love to just kind of think about different types of states out there, and then what the laws can actually do, what you guys anticipate as we move forward. Why don't we go the same order, Dr. Grudem, if you want to speak to it?
Sure. Well, one obvious result is that state level politics will become much more important, not only in abortion legislation, but in other legislation, because the principle is that there's no right to abortion. Seen in the 14th Amendment, in the wording, it says, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." It doesn't say anything about abortion. That's where the Roe majority found the right to abortion. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Well, if that is, if that means that laws about abortion revert to the states, then state policy matters are of great importance. And I don't know of any country in the world that gives as much independent power to states as the United States does to its states. And that means that Christians have great opportunity to influence the laws in their state. Arizona here has an organization called Center for Arizona Policy, which is an evangelical Christian influencing group to influence the politics of the state. And they have over 135 laws that have been passed here in Arizona under this sponsorship of Center for Arizona Policy. Other states have similar organizations, and I think it would be excellent if pastors in various states sought out those pro-life, pro-marriage, pro-religious freedom organizations. They're all loosely affiliated with Family Research Council, and were founded with a lot of encouragement from James Dobson 20 or more years ago. So there's a chance for Christians to become active in influencing politics and government for the good of the benefit of the people. And Romans 13:4 says, civil authority is God's servant for your good. And we should seek to have government fulfill that purpose to do good for its people. One other thing that has happened here in Arizona is the people working with the Center for Arizona Policy have intentionally sought to befriend members of the legislature, both Democrats and Republicans, and have brought pastors to meet with the legislators in their offices and ask if they can pray for them for specific needs in their lives. And they found a welcome in most all cases. When a state legislator receives a call from a pastor in his district who wants to meet with him, he's very likely to take it because he knows the pastor influences a lot of people. And that provides an opportunity for Christians to have influence for good in their individual states.
So I'll follow this up by just talking about a good example of how the state battle matters. Take Kentucky. So Kentucky has a trigger ban that was passed in 2018 that said, effective immediately after a situation where Roe v. Wade is overturned, abortion is effectively outlawed immediately in Kentucky. And so Friday afternoon, the Attorney General more or less certified that an abortion stopped, and abortions they're currently stopped right now in Kentucky. But the issue is, just because you live in a red state and you have good laws on the book, it doesn't mean that the fight's over, because we have activist organizations like Planned Parenthood, the ACLU, and they're filing suit against the trigger ban, saying that the trigger ban violates Kentucky's constitution, because their argument is, well, the Constitution federally may not grant a right to abortion, but Kentucky's Constitution grants a right to abortion. And so in Kentucky, we are in the process, and we'll vote on this in November. A pro-life organization has done the work to have an amendment ratification in November, where Kentuckians will vote to explicitly say whether or not they agree that the Constitution ought not to codify a right to abortion. And so hopefully Kentucky codifies this or ratifies this in November. And then at that point, the power of law to advocate for abortion effectively becomes impossible in a state like Kentucky. Now, the obverse of that is a place like California, which it was just announced that they're going to have a ballot initiative to effectively ratify a constitutional amendment to a right to abortion in their state. And so let me just say this: the fight is not over at all, especially if you live in a red state, because you're going to need to now fight this at the Supreme Court level in your state. This doesn't just clear the way for abortion to be forever banned in these states. And the real messiness of federalism that we have in our system of laws is, you have 50 Supreme Courts. You're going to have a hodgepodge of rulings at the state level about whether or not their constitutions are guaranteeing a right to abortion. And so this is where, honestly, I know they're always cautious about political mobilization within the church, but remove the Republican Democrat category for a second and just focus on righteousness versus unrighteousness. For righteousness to see the light of day, it's going to require active attention on the part of our local churches. And so pastors bringing these types of issues to the attention of their congregants. But I would just say, don't rest on your laurels at this point, because I think as a matter of politics and policy, when you sit on your hands, those on the other side are going to operate when you're idle. And they're going to do what they can to kind of etch their views into law. And so celebrate the victory, but you've got to keep fighting at this point.
I agree with Andrew. Thank you.
Yeah, good. And y'all can speak more to that. That kind of gets to the next question I was going to ask, though. There's two kind of places I want to go from there. One, though, is to what I'll call, or what has been called, the psychological effect of the law, right? And so that abortion was legal, was seen as right and legal. Obviously, that had a psychological effect on how Americans understood human life and how Americans understood, sexual liberty, let's say, or how people understood sexuality. So aside from, so I want to come back to kind of the legal battle, but just psychologically, do y'all see, as hopefully this keeps moving in the right direction, it changing? Does this slow down the sexual revolution at all? Does this change the way that we see human life and its value in the West? I'm curious y'all's thoughts on just the psychological impact of the law and maybe where we are in that conversation.
I think we have to agree that there's a teaching function that laws have, because there are many people in society who reason that abortion is legal, therefore it must be morally permissible. because our society, through its laws, has made it morally permissible. And now, with many states, maybe half the states, maybe more, enacting restrictions on abortion, the influence on the general public will be to tend, not everybody, but many people will tend to think it's illegal, therefore it's morally objectionable. And that will influence people's conduct and thinking. So it's all positive. To the degree to which it's positive and to what effect it's positive consequence, we don't know, but there's some definite teaching function that laws have.
Yeah. So, I mean, I agree with Dr. Grudem. I mean, you think about this, the categories of law inevitably shapes belief, belief shapes behavior, behavior over time shapes custom, which is why now in the aftermath of this decision, if you're watching CNN and watching kind of liberal Twitter respond, it's as though that they've had an aspect of their personhood took from them, because I think what this ruling has demonstrated is, I mean, at the intellectual level, we call it expressive individualism. I think we're learning in real time just how far etched that is into the mindset of Americans. The idea that there is moral significance to the use of one's body, and that public policy would dare to say that there are ways that you ought not to use your body, and there are duties that stem from how you use your body, and there are consequences to how you use your body. So I think that we are the aftershocks are demonstrating how far etched the sexual revolution is in our culture. Now, a couple things to say about the ruling itself in response to that worldview. At the legal level, you had Justice Clarence Thomas in the concurrence take aim at what's called substantive due process, which is where liberals over the last 50 years have inserted all of their judicial hopes and dreams that they can't get passed legislatively. They just find those rights within the 14th Amendment. And Justice Thomas, I mean, it is breathtaking what Justice Thomas did, and breathtaking in a good way, because he said that the primary vehicle that progressives have used to advance their agenda, henceforth, his suggestion is that the court should more or less vacate using that type of procedure to do any type of law whatsoever. And so that was breathtaking from a legal perspective, and it's causing the left to understandably freak out. I mean, I get why they're freaking out. If Justice Thomas had more people on that concurrence, they should be freaking out even more. But he vocalized something that could, in the future, serve as a trajectory and a legal pathway for future conservatives on the Supreme Court or on the lower level to take aim at substantive due process. The other thing I'll say here on the ruling and the worldview implication is both Justice Alito and Justice Thomas, in the opinion and the concurrence, specifically take aim at Justice Anthony Kennedy's language in Casey v. Planned Parenthood in 1992, where Anthony Kennedy uses this phrase that at the heart of liberty is the ability to define one's own existence and meaning and purpose. I'm misquoting somewhere along the lines, but in worldview studies, philosophy, and ethics, and all of the stuff, if you're in one of my classes, every single author cites Justice Kennedy's 1992 opinion as more or less like the zenith of expressive individualism as far as it being lived out in a court opinion. And Alito and Thomas said that that degree of thinking is unsustainable. At one point, Alito says, if we were to take Kennedy's logic to its conclusion, that would justify prostitution, drug use, and a whole bunch of other social pathologies. And so, I mean, to be very clear, the majority opinion in the concurrence goes out of its way to chip away at expressive individualism. And we should praise God for that. That doesn't mean that this battle is over whatsoever. And in fact, I would say it's still dramatically an uphill battle because the left has all of the cultural institutions. The right has been very, very good organizing on the political level and at the judicial level, but we've lost the culture for the most part in elite sectors of culture. So a lot of positive development, but there's still tremendous headwinds as well.
Yeah. No, that's super helpful. Thank you guys for that. Okay, kind of pivoting back now to the church's response. So, I have had a lot of personal conversations with friends of mine that are secularly minded individuals. Obviously, they know I'm a Christian pastor. Why do you Christians impose your views on the rest of the world? Those kinds of thoughts. I don't want the church to come off as triumphant in this moment, as if we've won something, even though in a sense we have. And so I'm curious, like, any advice you guys would give. How do we lead with, I would say, compassion, humility? How do we encourage our people to do so? Obviously, the kind of buzz critiques that are coming up right now, against, I would say, a Christian worldview are, and I know that both of you guys have written and thought a lot about this: concern for the poor, concern for women and their viability and health. And so speaking to some of those kind of arguments that I would say that a secular world is kind of throwing at the church and saying, well, now, you guys are going to create situations where a woman is no longer safe, or you guys are going to create situations where the poor will not be rightly cared for. Help us think through some of these kind of arguments and ways to respond that are right, that are helpful, and that are winsome.
Well, it's a great opportunity for churches to give even more support to pro-life organizations that have pregnancy counseling centers that help women who are pregnant and who don't have the financial means to earn a living and have a baby at the same time. Giving care and compassion to those who are pregnant and helping them in every way possible. That is already being done by many organizations, but more could be done, and it would be a great time for pastors this Sunday to commit to doing what they can to support these organizations that help women who are pregnant and having difficult situations.
Yeah, Jason, I mean, I agree with everything Dr. Grudem just said there. One thing I think that we should be very quick to do in our messaging is to dispute the assumption that the church hasn't already been doing this and being on the front lines for 5 decades.
Yeah.
If you go and look at the social science and polling data, it's church attending Christians, not just self-identified Christians, but church attending Christians that are a segment of the population most likely to volunteer their time, most likely to give of their monies and resources to these ends. I'm not trying to say that we need to take a victory lap and pat ourselves in the back and to say we're perfect. That's not at all the implication. But I think, quite frankly, a lot of Christian celebrities on social media were adopting this posture of, well, it's time to show up, church, as though the church hasn't been showing up already. And that's just a cheap talking point. So I just don't want to grant the assumption that we haven't been doing it already. I've heard some people use the phrase, well, now the pro-life movement really begins. I understand the sentiment behind that, but I also reject it because that assumes that 50 years of scholarship, political organization, and pregnancy crisis center work has been, playing second fiddle to post-Roe opportunities, and that's just not accurate. As far as the messaging is concerned, I dropped in the chat an article that Ryan Anderson and I wrote. It's responding to the argument that opposing abortion is implementing some type of theocracy, as though you would see in The Handmaid's Tale. And I think we need to dispute that argument And the simplest way to dispute that is to simply say that abortion laws are simply homicide laws applied to unborn life. So if we're willing to apply the principle that life is sacred outside the womb, then life is sacred inside the womb. And this is where there's some degree of pro-life apologetics that needs to come in. Scott Klusendorf's book, The Case for Life, was made free and available by Crossway. It's an outstanding book, and I study this issue philosophically. I'm not trying to say that we don't have good questions posed to us that we need to answer for, but the Christian case for life is eminently rational and sound philosophically. And so it's not as though we shouldn't appeal to the Bible. Absolutely, we should. But we should also be willing to say that if you support abortion laws, in principle, you would have to support the types of laws that would actually be okay with committing murder against toddlers, because the same type of principle underwrites both. And so there is some philosophical work that we need to be doing here. But again, not to overtly self-promote, but I'm going to read that article and study this up, because we need to push back that this is about implementing a theocracy, or it's about Christian domination in the culture, or stupid overtures to white Christian nationalism. No, this is about justice. It's about the common good. It's about restoring a more expansive understanding of human dignity. The left loves to talk about human rights and human dignity. Let's be very clear what they're doing in response to the Dobbs decision. They want to draw narrower distinctions and narrower scopes around who earns the concept of dignity and rights, whereas Christians want to expand the scope of that. And let me just suggest, in the history of ideas, it's never gone well for society when you have groups of people arguing for restricting rights and dignity for a group within a population. That's really dangerous. And so we should go on the offense, make the arguments, be winsome, as Jason says, but make the arguments.
Could add, Andrew, and I agree with that, what you've said. From a philosophical standpoint, that's very strong. From a very common sense layperson standpoint, if someone says this is Christians trying to implement a religion or impose a theocracy, that's foolish. All laws against stealing are based on a moral conviction that stealing is wrong. All major religions, I believe, teach that stealing is wrong. That doesn't mean if you have a law against stealing that you're imposing a religion on the nation. The same with laws against murder. And we want to protect an unborn child doesn't mean that we're imposing a religious view on them, even though the reason for our conviction is probably based in our teachings of our Bible. But the moral case against murder of unborn children, Andrew has rightly said, is a case that can be made without an appeal to the Bible, but just appeal to people's common sense of right and wrong. And we should emphasize freedom of religion. I'm going to switch just a bit here and say that from a larger overview perspective, a big issue perspective, my first response to hearing the Roe v. Wade was overturned, my first response was, thank you, God, you have not given up on the United States of America. I think we can tend to look at the sins that are prevalent in our society and think it would be right for God to judge us and to take away our status as a leader among nations. And we could not object if God did that, but it seems to me that there is significant evidence that he has not given up on the United States, but he still has a purpose for us, to be the beacon of freedom for the rest of the world, to be the defender of allies, to be a base for worldwide evangelism and teaching, a center for world technology and a scientific leader and a medical leader and protector of freedom of the seas and many other things. There's still much to be done in the United States, and we have reason to be thankful that God is not now giving signs of judgment, but signs of hope that there is a good future for our nation and its role in the world. The second thing is, it seems to me to be a reinforcement that God, in directing the lives of the founders of the United States in their deliberations at the Constitutional Convention, God gave us a constitution that is remarkably strong because it has the mechanisms built in for self-correcting if the government begins to go astray from its original purposes. And the mechanism for self-correction here came about in a complex way. I remember, it was anyway, 20, 25 years ago, I had dinner in Washington, D.C. with the chairman of the subcommittee on the Constitution in the House Judiciary Committee. And I brought to him 3 or 4 ideas I had for how the overreach of the Supreme Court and its excessive taking of power to itself that it did not have, and making up laws that had no basis in the Constitution, in the original meaning of the Constitution. I had several ideas for how the Supreme Court's power could be reined in, and I said, look, you're the chairman of the subcommittee on the Constitution in the U.S. House of Representatives in the Judiciary Committee, and any reform of the Supreme Court would start with you. He was a Yale Law School graduate and very well informed about what was going on at the Supreme Court. And every time I brought up a possible solution, he said, we've tried that, doesn't work. The only way to change the situation is to appoint new justices who will restrain themselves and restrict their interpretation of the original meaning of the Constitution. And that has now happened. But the system is an incredibly healthy system. There's self-correction built into it. And the self-correction was because regular elections are required. We had a change in members of Congress. Because freedom of speech and press and assembly are protected, people could campaign on different political agenda. Because the separation of powers, it means the executive branch, the president appointed new justices and reformed the court. The people elected a conservative president to bring that about. And the president appointed justices that changed the Supreme Court for the better. So I'm thankful for the self-correcting mechanisms built into the Constitution. It's remarkable. We're not subject to a dictatorship like China or many other countries. So I'm hopeful.
That's a great word. I think that's a great jumping point to kind of the next thing I wanted to talk to you guys about, just in terms of the ability of the government that we have in place, both at a local and state level, and then obviously at a federal level. Christians, obviously, and I appreciate what you said earlier, Andrew, and Dr. Grudem echoed, I don't really know anybody other than Christians that are involved in crisis pregnancy centers, that are involved with foster care and adoption. I mean, there are certainly people, but the majority of the folks that I know in those spheres are believers. And so I appreciate the word you gave. The past 30 plus years, it's really been Christians leading the way on those things. Are there public policy things, though, that Christians should be particularly concerned about? And obviously there's been a lot going around, obviously healthcare, and what that looks like. Some people I know have brought up the idea of some sort of daycare funded by the public. What are public policy things that, and obviously some of these get a little tricky in terms of just, across the board moral clarity, but what are some public policy things that you guys would say, hey, Christians should be concerned about this, or is the best way to address this simply at the private level? How would you guys respond to that kind of line of thinking?
Dr. Grudem, do you mind if I go first with this one?
Well, I have a book called Politics According to the Bible, published by Zondervan. And in it, I deal with, I think, 60 political issues. Now, some of those, my view will be persuasive to people, and some will not be persuasive to everybody, but I took a stab at it anyway. some things that come to mind. I think Christians should believe that the government is given to defend us against harm. What the Constitution says, provide for the common defense. That's from enemies from without. And I think there's a moral case to be made for a strong military defense to counter the potential attacks from China or Iran or Russia. I think that's a moral issue. It's what Romans 13:4 says is the government's responsibility to punish those who do wrong and praise those who do right. Ensure domestic tranquility is part of the Constitution's definition of what government should do. That I think there are implications for the immigration situation in ensuring domestic tranquility. I think, and I'm going to say I've written about this, and people may differ with me, but I think that the climate change campaign, the global warming alarmism, is misdirected. It is based on an assumption that God has put in the earth fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, natural gas, that are booby traps, so that if we use them, we destroy the earth. And I don't think that's the way God created the earth. I could go on, but
so I would say first and foremost, we'll have to introduce a principle of just political prudence, meaning that Christians could have good faith disagreements on all of the entailments of how public policy would address this.
I agree.
For example, there's always trade-offs in public policy. So if public policy implements a program of like universal daycare, that sounds nice on the one hand, I understand it. It also encourages separating children from their parents. So that's the negative trade-off. And so we'll have to consider that. But I mean, there are real tangible ways that public policy could address this. I'm thinking right now of the proposal put forward by Senator Romney, which would be to create a tax system that's intentionally designed to give preference to the family, which would include monthly subsidies for children in the house, which is, again, would it cover all of the costs for children? No, not necessarily, but it is a symbolic way to communicate that policy does care about the well-being of children. And listen, a Christian could disagree with the Mitt Romney proposal, and that's totally legitimate. What I would caution against, and I saw this again happening on Twitter, is that the pro-life response requires just full-scale adoption of socialism. I think that's a little bit too quick of a judgment, and to understand that I think the free market does have a role to play. Public policy has a role to play as well, and there are going to be debates around those. But we should be willing to have those debates. I'd also say this: in all of these determinations, you have to determine like what are your political priorities. So for me, like I would call myself a family first social conservative, which means that's number one. Limited government is number two, and then probably fiscal issues are number three. And I would still consider myself a fiscal conservative. I used to work for the Heritage Foundation, for Pete's sake. But that means for me, like I'm willing to allow my views on economics to yield and bend to my prioritization of the family. And so we just need to be clear about what are the principles guiding our thinking on those, and doing some type of ethical triage in the local church where we are able to have these discussions without necessarily saying, well, if you support monthly child payments, therefore you are a socialist. Mitt Romney's not a socialist. Personally, on an individual level, I would support something like that. If Dr. Grudem didn't, that's fine. We could have a friendly disagreement on policy. But what we're both interested in at the end of the day is a right motive and a right conclusion, which is we want to love our neighbor and we want to see our neighbor protected in law. And there are just going to be some determinations and differences on how to do that.
Would you agree? I'm sorry.
Dr. Grudem, go ahead.
Andrew,
I was just going to say,
would you agree that it would be helpful for churches to have debates on debates or dialogues on these questions where Christians may have legitimate differences, and put them out before the members of the church, maybe a Sunday evening or a Thursday evening, something like that, instead of ignoring them, bring Christian reasoning to bear on them from different viewpoints, and then that would give a signal that these different viewpoints are acceptable within our congregation. But here are the arguments on both sides.
Yeah, no, I think that's legitimate. I mean, one thing people ask me about, what can churches do to be informed about public square issues? And the model I always give is the Kentucky Baptist Convention has a committee on public affairs that kind of monitors public policy for the whole state. I think it's very reasonable for churches to establish public affairs committees at the local church level, where they're not issuing resolutions and proclamations every single time they gather, but they meet once a quarter to evaluate what are the pressing public policy issues happening in the culture that impact their local congregation and how the congregation can actually get involved. So I think that's just a tangible way that churches can show that they're attentive to these issues. And when something does arise to the level of needing to address it, it's not just the one church member who spends too much time on Fox News or on the comment section on Facebook, but it's an actual committee that's been established to adjudicate, okay, this actually matters. We're bringing this before the pastor and the elders. They'll decide whether or not to formally move this up the food chain for the church to officially address this.
I'm sorry, guys, my internet froze for a second there. There was another question I wanted to get to. I'm sorry I missed the response to that. But one of the things that Andrew said earlier that I thought was important and helpful is I've totally lost my train of thought, but just understanding your principles and realizing there's certain areas of disagreement. There was a question about business leaders, and I'd like to hear both of y'all speak to this. Obviously, there's been a lot of conversation about how the business community, and I don't know if we lost Dr. Grudem in that interchange.
He's here.
Okay, I'm sorry. But there was a question about business leaders. How do you, how should business leaders lead through this? Obviously, there's, going to be a lot of discussion, and there's certain businesses that are paying for, people in their companies. Obviously, that's not a decision the Christian business leader would make. And obviously, I think we can all see through, Dick's Sporting Goods, for example, is cost-driven, not concern-driven. But what advice would you give to, what advice would you give to business leaders in this time that are trying to face some of the concerns on people that they're given care over, that they're overseeing in their business environments?
Well, I'm not sure I know all the answers to this. I'm sure I don't know all the answers, Jason. But one thing I've been aware of, it seemed to me to be a difficulty that Christian business leaders face, is what happens when we come to Pride Month and there's pressure to put on some program or communication that affirms the moral validity of gay lifestyle. I think that's something the Christian business owner, I would say, probably should not do. Give moral approval to something that the Bible doesn't approve. I'd be open to hearing arguments on the other side about that. But I imagine Christian business owners face that challenge regularly.
So, I think we want to establish some baseline principles and to say that Christian business owners need to be attentive in not participating in any direct or indirect cooperation with their employees obtaining abortions. That requires, how do we think about how far removed you are from someone's direct agency? But I just think that, you as pastors will be on the front line of this, counseling business leaders in your church that we shouldn't be facilitating access to abortion. That's just a basic moral principle. I think there's some debates in churches about whether or not you would discipline someone in your church who is running a payday loan industry because that's predatory on the poor. I think we want to apply a similar principle here and to say that, are you a business first or a Christian first? Hopefully if you're a Christian business, this would not entertain your mind at all. But this does speak to the bigger issue of the difficulty that Christians are going to find themselves in certain elements in corporate life, in HR departments.
Andrew, what do you think about Christians being pressured to endorse Pride Week or Pride Month for homosexuals?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely they shouldn't. This is one of those things where at some point we're going to have to draw a line. I get asked the question about, I'm being forced to put my pronouns in my email signature. And perhaps I'm too stubborn on this, but my response to that is no. Language is symbolic. It's attempting to name reality. You should not be a party to or help facilitate cultural delusion. I know that's pretty hardcore, but I think a failure to draw the line somewhere is going to result in a failure to draw the line anywhere. Speaking personally, like my family, last week I canceled Disney Plus. And I hated doing that because our kids love Disney, right? Well, I initially had this category for, all right, I believe in a big, diverse public square. I know there's a lot of people out there. Just because you're gay doesn't mean you don't have a right to watch Disney movies and go to Disney World. So, pluralistic, big picture public square. Okay. Then you find out on June 30th, Disney on the app is doing a Pride sing-along streaming on Friday night with the LA Trans Choir. So now they're targeting children with ideology. And I was like, all right, officially done. Can't do anymore. That's where the line is for me. And so I think the question as pastors you want to ask yourself is, do I have a line, first and foremost, and I hope you do, where am I going to draw that line? And then let me just say practically, we are going to have to, as local churches, begin to think through the categories of having like benevolence funds for Christians in corporate workspaces that can't persist in their jobs. Isn't that wild to think about? So what are you going to do when you have someone in a certain industry that can't continue working there because they're going to lose their job? I think, after the family relying on its resources and other family resources and extended family, the church ought to step in and help. So I think we're going to have to enter into more burden sharing, bear one another's burdens.
And that's certainly
be thinking forward about that.
There's certainly a precedent for that in church history. It's not the first time Christians have been through something like that. Well, guys, this has been a super helpful conversation. I want to honor everybody's time. Let me close with just kind of 3 common things that you'll hear on the street. And just, how do you speak into that? Just if you could be succinct. I'm just having a conversation with somebody that I'm passing. Here's 3 common things. And this is one of the questions that came in. So the first one is my body, my choice. You hear that. What's a succinct Christian response to that?
Excuse me. What about the body of the child within you? Do you have a right to take the life of another person?
Yeah, that's pretty succinct.
I agree with that. That's exactly the right response. Is that assumes that the rights of one overwhelm the rights of another, and that's bad philosophy. The embryo, the fetus, the zygote, whatever you want to call the unborn child, has all of the necessary genetic components from its conception to begin the process of development. And so personhood begins at conception. Biology tells us that the child is ready to develop given the space, which means that and all of us were former zygotes. And so the issue is that our mothers didn't have a right to abort us just because we were lesser developed. Because why does development play a role in determining whether someone gets to live or not live?
You guys already really spoke to this. Well, let me, before I say that, something that was succinctly said to me earlier was, the question really comes down to what is it? If it's not a life, there's no response necessary. If it is a life, there's no response, right? I mean, if it is a life, then what justification can you give to take human life? The another one that you guys already spoke to, but I do think people hear in just a succinct answer, I think is why do Christians feel like they can impose their beliefs on everyone else? And again, you guys already spoke to this, but maybe just in a succinct way, how would y'all speak into that in the public square?
We're not trying to impose our beliefs on anyone else. We're trying to influence people's thinking, influence people's voting. And that's what democracy is. Individual members of the democracy attempt to influence one another by conversation.
I would simply say that a pro-life law is no more of an imposition on anyone than is a homicide law.
Yeah. Well, I feel like the other kind of popcorn things you guys have really already spoke to. This has been such a helpful conversation. I just really want to thank both of you, and not just for this conversation, but for your larger body of work. Dr. Grudem, I know that basically everyone in this call has benefited from your teaching and your writing. Andrew, I know that many, if not most, if not all of the people on this call have benefited from the amazing work that you're doing. So for both of you brothers, I'm grateful, and thanks for taking time to be with us today. I've enjoyed seeing even some of the comments between you brothers on the chat feature. If y'all ever want to get in contact with somebody that's in this group and you need their information, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I can help make connections. Again, would love to see some of you guys in October here in Atlanta, Georgia. Really, the goal of that meeting is just to do this, to have meaningful conversations, and to put guys together so we can help one another maneuver this world in a way that is honoring to our Lord Jesus. So thank you, brothers, so much. Let me just say a quick prayer of thanks, and I'll let you guys get back to your day. Father, we do just thank you for the help of this conversation, for the gifts that you've given Dr. Grudem and Dr. Walker. Just thank you so much for their insight that I know has been helpful to us, and I pray that it would be helpful to our churches. We do ask, Lord, as we continue in this conversation, in this moment that you, Dr. Grudem said, would restore hope and a sense of your divine justice to our nation, and that you would use us as leaders and our churches to that end. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, guys, so much.
Thank you.